I have a really big trigger of not being seen, if I'm not seen or heard, and that really sends me over the edge.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lear. I'm your host. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, an author, educator, and the founder of Reconcile, an app to help you make your relationship the best it can be or get ready for your next relationship. Welcome to the Yearning Heart podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing realistic expectations for a partner, triggers, understanding what is yours and what is your partner's to work on in a relationship, developing the ability to listen to each other, self-care and tools to use when you're triggered and your partner isn't available to meet your needs in that moment, dating a narcissist, red flags and signs, and what makes a good relationship. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Yearning Heart podcast, where we discuss with everyday people our journeys towards love, our growth, and the yearnings of our hearts. Delighted to have Kristina with me to talk about her relationships and learning and growth. I've known Kristina for many, many years. She is a very good friend. Kristina, first I want to start with, when I bring up the word relationship, what comes up for you?
A little bit of nervousness, actually. I don't know why.
Okay, so really,
when you bring up the word relationship, I automatically think with it my significant partner.
yes.
For me, which would be a man.
So you immediately think about a significant partner or that sort of category of thing?
Yeah, intimate relationship, not friendship.
Right. It is definitely more about intimate relationships.
Yes.
And because I've known you a long time, I know a lot of your history, and I know that you've done a ton of work around relationships and you know a ton. So I guess I really want to hear your story about what you've learned as you've traveled this relationship path, where you started and where you are now.
Wow. Well, the first thing that came to mind was compassion. Like, I feel when I first, and this is youth, I'm sure, when my first relationships in my late teens and early 20s that were big for me, I kind of saw the other person as a god, or that they were going to fix the happiness in my life. And, of course that never happened, because that's unrealistic. Yeah. But I really just didn't have any idea what a real relationship meant, even though my parents have been married for a very, very long time. And I witnessed a pretty good relationship between them, I would say. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. Like, I really, even though I felt in love, I don't think I really understood what connection meant, and having compassion and letting another person exist within a relationship.
Right.
And throughout the years, that's really what I've learned. I've learned a ton, but that's a big one.
Yeah. So what a real relationship really is.
What a real relationship really is, and what real expectations are in that relationship. When I say real, all expectations are real, of course, to us, but what's realistic expectation and what is yours. So what I mean by saying that is a realistic expectation on the other person, and then owning and figuring out, even just figuring out what is, I don't want to say damage, but triggers, I guess is a better word. What is your trigger, and what is actually yours for you to work on, and what is the other person. And right. Also having compassion for the other person and having compassion for yourself. All of that is huge in navigating a relationship, because nobody's going to be perfect.
Right.
And I'm sure everybody hears this all the time, but nobody's going to be perfect. And it's really being, I think, able to probably navigate your own feelings almost more than other people's feelings.
So you started in a place where the other person was sort of a fantasy.
That's a better way of putting it, Jennifer.
Like a placeholder for your, to make you feel good, and you didn't really even know who they were or what they were or what they needed, or all you knew is,
I made it all up in my mind.
of what they would be for you.
Yeah, what they would be for me.
Then through the course of a number of relationships, you came to realize that you had to sort through your feelings. Why do you get upset when certain things happen? What is realistic to expect? What can you ask for? What is your own stuff? So it sounds like a massive sorting process.
I don't know how much of that was me or how much of that is just youth in general, but I had a particularly hard time navigating it. And I'm not really sure why. When I was young, there's of course different levels of this, and I've met plenty of young people that maybe were raised a little bit different or had a more realistic idea of what a relationship is, and just where they're able to navigate it a little bit better. But this was my experience, and
Right.
not everybody's, of course.
So in terms of triggers, like what are your triggers? What is it that gets you activated, that makes you less present to yourself in a relationship?
That's a loaded question. Where's my list? I think it's all kinds of things. I mean, what I'll say right off the top of my head, but there's more than this, is I have a really big trigger of not being seen, if I'm not seen or heard. And that really sends me over the edge. And of course, that's my thing. And how that might manifest itself, it might be that people interrupt me, or they don't listen to what I'm saying, and they're not seeing my good intentions, or even trying to listen to hear what I'm trying to tell them. They're just interrupting and wanting to have their own side heard, which I think is very natural, but it is a big trigger for me.
Right. That's actually one of my triggers. And I also know that I've stepped on your toes in that area before. But yeah, so that I think it's a big trigger for a lot of people, this idea, this thing where they aren't taking the time to listen to who you are, what you have to say, what your feelings are. And then it leaves, like for me, the voice that would come up would be, why didn't you listen? Why aren't you paying attention? Why aren't you paying attention to who I am and what I've told you? Like that is the voice that comes up for me. There's an actual voice that comes up, and then I know I'm triggered. But I also know the other person is not paying attention. And maybe I need to say, I need you to pay attention to what's going on right now, because I'm feeling this feeling and it's not a good feeling. But it sounds like we actually have similar triggers in that area.
Yeah. And some of that's nonverbal too, which I think is, if somebody's really good at picking up nonverbal signals, then I think that can be a way to communicate as well. But it's really usually not fair, because speaking up and being able to speak up, which would be my stuff if I'm not able to speak up, isn't really about the other person. Them not paying attention, sure, that might be about the other person. But if I can't speak up and say, hey, this is really important to me right now that you listen to me, then that's on me.
Right.
And then if you don't listen, that's on them.
But sometimes you do try to speak and people don't listen. So you've had to learn how to speak and communicate clearly, which probably wasn't a strong point when you were younger, I'm guessing.
No.
And so over the years, you've learned you get to be direct and say what you need, and then you get to see how they respond, and if they're capable of paying attention to what you need.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that is one big thing that I think I've learned in being in a relationship, is how to express myself in a constructive way so the other person can hear it, in a calm way so the other person can hear it, and also so they can have a chance to understand where I'm at, and then I can in turn be heard and listened to, and that's a two-way street. Both people have to be able to do that. And
right.
It doesn't always work that way, because sometimes one person's in more distress than the other, and there's that's something that has to be navigated in a relationship. And I think that was always hard for me. I've learned that.
Right. That was a learning curve for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so now what happens when you do ask for your needs to be met in relationship? Like, is the person, as you think back on your relationships, was the other person able to hear you, or generally was there a block on their part where they weren't attuned enough to their own feeling sense or whatever that they could actually slow down and pay attention?
I think I've had a variety of both. The relationships probably that I've had that haven't lasted very long, I think there probably was there was a block there for them where they couldn't take in my perspective, which is
Right.
extremely painful. Well, it's extremely painful for me.
Right.
But sure, if the relationship is a good one, then the other person, and maybe not always, because they're people too. They might not be in a position to listen at that time, but a good relationship, they will be able to listen. And if they're not, they can say, I can't listen to this right now, but let's get back to that and get back to this conversation. And that's also very fair to do.
Right. So if they're triggered or something's going on and they can't actually stop in that moment and attend to you, as long as they say, I want to finish this, but I can't do it right now. Can we talk again later about it? Then that's fine. Yeah.
And I have to be okay with that. So that's another thing that I've learned. Instead of continuing to push another person where they're not in a space that they can listen and it might turn out really badly, I have to be able to accept that. And that's a hard thing to do in a relationship, especially if you're upset and really want to be heard, to go, okay, my partner cannot hear me right now. And I want them to hear me. So I'm going to step back and I'm going to wait until they're ready. That's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, especially if you're triggered and your emotions are heightened. And if you are anxious attachment, which I'm going to guess you probably are, that's certainly my history, you want the answers right now. You want the connection and the closure right that second. Whereas if you're more avoidant, you're going to be like, get me away from this pile of feelings. Because avoidant people tend to not be that comfortable or even know their feelings that well. And anxious people tend to get into anger. The connection is being blocked and the other person won't meet their needs right that second because they're anxious for the connection. And you've learned to slow that down and go, I'm okay. I can wait.
I'm anxious.
I'm anxious, but this is another person and they're not identical and they don't have the same need at this second. And I'll live an hour or two or three or four or till tomorrow until we can work on this.
And a big tool for me that I have learned is breathing, because my body will get involved in this, and there are definite signs of being anxious. My heart will start to race. I can almost not even stand to be in my own skin when this is happening. I have like not a complete anxiety attack. Well, it depends, I guess, but anxiety. And so I have to pull myself away and use some breathing techniques in order to calm myself down.
And you've learned how to do that. Is that a fairly recent learning, or when did you start figuring that out?
Well, I think it's fairly recent, within the last year.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you started realizing my body is freaking out. My body needs attention. I need to help myself calm down so I can get through this without amping it up even higher.
Without, then it's destructive to the relationship. Because if I'm not able to, like I said, let the other person take a minute until they can listen to me, no matter what it is, no matter if they are having a reaction or they're on a phone call or they're receiving a phone call or they're right in the middle of something and I need to be heard, it doesn't matter what the reason is that they can't hear me right now. And in order to stop myself from being anxious, that's what I have to do. I have to walk away and I have to take some space and I have to breathe.
Right. So it's a big piece of self-care to get yourself through when you're triggered.
It's a huge piece of self-care. And I also find that if I meditate on a regular basis, even if it's for 10 minutes a day, it helps me to stay practiced So if I need to grab at that every 6 months or whatever it is when I'm having my anxious attachment style triggered, if I
Right.
need to grab from that, I'm practiced at it.
Right.
It might be a different technique, but at least I know how to tune into my breath. So I'm trying to stay practiced at it.
Right. So that's been a really big help. That's actually that's great that you got that skill set developed. I mean, a lot of this is about
I
developing.
don't know if it's developing.
Okay, but I mean, a lot of what we have to do in relationships is develop new capacities, and that's an example of developing a new capacity to slow down, tune into the body, take care of the body, have positive self-talk, which is I'll be okay, we'll get through this, we'll talk about it later, whatever your self-talk is, and and get through it without it turning into a giant issue, problem, fight, conflict, whatever, because you're dysregulated and the other person can't meet your needs in that moment.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about this, it makes intimate relationships sound really complicated, right? And they are really complicated. And I think that they are really complicated because for whatever reason, and I think some friendships can do this too, and some family members can do this too, but for whatever reason, the person that you usually pick isn't going to be easy. You're in there to learn. I mean, it might be enjoyable and easy sometimes and not easy other times. There's a mix, but you have something to learn from each other, and it's a real it's it's so connected. It can be really difficult to navigate because we all have stuff that gets brought up from our past, whether that's your childhood, whether that's past relationships, depending on how young you are and how much experience you have.
Right.
Even as you get older, you have more of those experiences. So you have more trauma just naturally the older you get, but you also have more skills. Hopefully, that's the goal.
Right.
But but yeah, I think navigating that sounds the way we're talking about it sounds like nobody should get in a relationship because oh my god, but but that's not the case.
But you're in a relationship, so obviously you're still cool with relationships. Yeah.
After everything I've been through, I'm still cool with relationships. It's very enjoyable and a good one.
I'm glad to hear that. That's really nice. So, so many different directions to go in. How do you think this not being heard wound, where do you think that came from for you? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think can be a little bit generational too. I'm just going to say that and preface it. It's absolutely from childhood. Now, I don't know where to start this. Okay, so being the age that I am, which is 57, I don't mind saying it. My parents were products of the 50s and 60s and 70s where there weren't any tool, and they were young when they had me. A lot of people my age had young parents, and they didn't have a lot of tools, and they definitely didn't have a lot of communication skills. Therapy was only for the extremely mentally ill. And so listening skills and how to navigate children, they just didn't have it. And so there was no way I was going to be listened to or learn those types of skills. I would say there was more avoidance skills that I probably learned. And I think that that's kind of generational.
Uh-huh.
So what was the question again? I lost track.
Just how your parents impacted this wound, this trigger of.
So I think that is how.
Yeah.
I don't think that they were able to. I didn't have a good example of two people that communicated with each other really well. And if they did communicate with each other, they did it behind closed doors because it was one of the things where they didn't want the kids to see. And then if I was acting up or my sister was acting up or my brother was acting up, it was probably more anger outbursts to get us to calm down instead of finding out why we were acting up. And that would be an example of asking how I was feeling, why I was at, and and then I would learn good communication skills.
Right.
So that didn't happen, and I would be heard and seen.
Right.
if none of that's happening as a child, then and it's just reactions from your parents on that are put onto you while you're having a reaction to whatever it is. Kids, they don't have the skills to
Right.
make a difference.
Yeah.
So you don't learn. You don't learn. You're not seen. You're not heard. You don't learn to ask in a constructive way to have your needs met, and you just don't learn those skills.
Right. Right.
You don't witness those skills.
You're not feeling understood because you're being shut down, basically.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
they just didn't have the skill set to do it the way you needed it. I mean, it wasn't their fault. They didn't have the resources or the skill set, and they were probably raised in such a way that they didn't see the right behavior either.
That's right. And I think that, so I had to learn that as I
continued. Yeah.
Yeah. I made friends that we could listen to each other and talk to each other. And I got into therapy and I learned these skill sets right outside of parenting.
Right.
Which I have great parents. It's not their fault. They were a product of what they're a product of. And
Right.
I think from what I've witnessed, not all, there's still a lot of screwed up parents out there, but I've witnessed a lot of young people that seem to have those skills more, because I think people of my generation, or even one or two generations younger, that are having children now, maybe in their 30s now, have developed those skills from people that were my age.
Right.
And so I think in that way things have gotten probably better.
Right. Good.
There's parenting classes, there's things you can do. There was none of that when we
Right. There's all kinds of information and education out there that there didn't used to be.
Right.
Which can really change a person's trajectory in a relationship and in how they raise their children and everything. So I have two more questions that are sort of pulling on me. One is, I know you've been in some relationships with people that were pretty narcissistic. And I want to know what you learned, what you can offer the people who are listening about either how to avoid them or what to do about them if you find yourself in a relationship with someone who's highly narcissistic, and what that even looks like. How do you know you're in a relationship like that?
Yeah, I think that's really tricky. I think some people would probably intuitively know it more than me, or listen to it. I mean, you can intuitively know it and maybe not even listen to it, but when you're meeting somebody. But I think narcissism presents itself in a lot of different ways. I think one of the ways it presents itself is somebody who's really charming, who might love bomb you. Now, I think in a beginning of a relationship, I think it's kind of natural to love bomb the other person on both ends.
Right.
Whether you're a narcissist or not, whether you're male or female, I think it can be natural. So that part is tricky to navigate. So I think it would be hard to tell in the very beginning of a relationship. So I think a lot of people find themselves, they think they've met the perfect person because they're so charming and nice, and they want to win you over, right? And as both people in a relationship do when it's new. And so in the beginning, I would say probably the first 3 months, it would be very, very hard to tell. So you kind of have to get into it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Right, because you already are hook, line, and sinker in love at that point, generally.
Right. And I think that there can be different signs of small little manipulations that you can see. And it depends if somebody is a grandiose narcissist or a covert narcissist. I think that those are all different things. But if you find yourself noticing that somebody has tried to manipulate you or gaslight you, and it can just be one little thing right in the beginning of a relationship, you should heed the warning and at least keep an eye on it so you don't get too far into it,
right,
to where it's really hard to back out.
So in other words, you would say, that's a red flag. I'm not going to just push it away. I'm going to pay attention. And if this happens over again, starts happening repetitively, that means I'm with someone that I'm not going to be able to work it out with.
This is a very little example, but I could have used it as a sign. So I was with a man, and in the very beginning, when he started taking me out, I was just enamored with it, right? And and he picked me up and took me out in his car, which was like a collectible car. So we were just going out for a little cruise. He wanted to take me for a ride, and he turned up the music so loud that it was deafening. You couldn't even be in the car. And the reason why is because he wanted to be seen by all the other people that we were driving around, and all the heads would turn and look at us in the car, right? And I remember thinking, I said to him, I said, can we turn down the music? This is really hurting my ears. And he didn't. And you guys are all probably thinking, oh my God, why did she go on a second date with this guy? But it just didn't dawn on me at that time that his need to be seen by everybody outside was a sign that it was all about him, and that he wasn't concerned that he might be hurting my ears or I was mortified by the behavior.
Right. So we've got this car with this girl and this man, and look at me, and not, oh, this person I really care about is not comfortable right now. I need to deal with that. And that's the contrast between a narcissistic viewpoint versus a attuned partner viewpoint.
Right.
So that's a great example. That's a great example. Okay. Very clear. And it's really, really clear. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, so you're in a relationship right now. What is the best thing about the relationship you're in right now?
There's a lot of good things about the relationship I'm in right now, but I think the biggest one is that he's a friend of mine, and he genuinely, absolutely cares about my well-being, and I care about his. Outside of any gratification you get with a partner who loves you, just outside of it. So if there's something that's bothering me and I tell him, even though he might be confused by it and not understand it, he doesn't want me to be uncomfortable or unhappy, so he will take it in. And I think that that is the best thing. And I will do the same for him, of course.
Right. So there's a mutual caring and concern for the other person's well-being that is above everything else. And that's a foundation for how this relationship feels to you.
That's correct. Because it doesn't always feel good, you know. I mean, people get tired and hungry and cranky and, you know, whatever it is. Right. You know, people go through stuff in their life. So it's not always pleasant, but I know even if he is going through something or I'm going through something, the foundation is really, when it comes down to it, we care about each other's well-being, period.
Right.
And happiness.
Right. Well, that's a great note to end on. Is there anything else you want to add or say, or is there anything you're yearning for that you don't have, or is it just you're in the process of figuring it out?
I'm just in the process of figuring it out. And I think that is life, right? If I'm going to say anything, that is life. And I tend to get hard on myself for not being perfect, and I get discouraged. And I think having compassion for yourself, no matter what you're going through, even if you act out, even if you're not perfect, having self-compassion is the most important thing to get you through life. And life doesn't get easier. It's always life, no matter if you're young or if you're old. It might get a little bit easier, but you just have to have compassion and stick with it, and you'll be okay.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kristina.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining me on this podcast. I hope you found it both interesting and informative. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. You can also find me on social media under either Weekensile or Jennifer Lear LMFT. Please try our app, Weekensile, to help you create your best relationships. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. Giving us a 5-star review will help us get our podcast out. Thanks.